Hello and welcome to Grime Time, Reason's special news, views and opinion show with me, Darren Grimes. Now please do remember to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's show. Comment along because I can see all of your comments and I'll try my best to respond to a few of them. Now there's a link in the description too to our GoFundMe page. It really does help to keep us going and doing what we're doing when you guys, big or small, contribute to keeping Reasoned online. So thanks so much for your support. It really is incredibly humbling. And if I can't reply to all of your emails, comments, I'm sorry, I really wish I could, but just know that it means a hell of a lot. Right, on today's Grime Time, I'm going to be discussing The Observer's so-called journalist Carole Cadwalladr. I'm going to be discussing some utterly damning findings from the regulator OfCom on the BBC and Question Time's plummeting viewing figures. I'll be speaking to Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute about the UK's need for a free speech act similar to that in the United States of America. And I want to address the liberal hypocrisy over the UK's cut to foreign aid. Anyway, it's a jam-packed show, so if you enjoy it, I work hard on it, if I do say so myself, so please do like and comment as it really does help with. Cheers. After years of being smeared by this so-called journalist, with preposterous fantasies splashed gleefully in the pages of The Observer, her paper, serious liberals that rightly complain about the harm that conspiracy theories around things like 5G, around COVID being linked to phone masts, or that the coronavirus is a hoax by Bill Gates, have all, I'm afraid to say, far too often fallen hook, line and sinker for their own totally nutty and preposterous conspiracy theories simply because they make them feel good politically. And, conveniently, they were anti-Brexit. For a start, they say that people like me can't possibly hold conservative views and opinions, that all conservative outlets, like Reasoned, must be funded by dark money. No one can possibly hold views that are pro-nation, pro-democracy, pro-limited government and pro-business without being duped by big data or dark forces with big pockets. And we saw that uniquely, especially strongly with the vote for Brexit. We were told that I, through my campaign Believe, teamed up with Dominic Cummings, the former advisor to the Prime Minister. His outfit, Vote Leave. We teamed up to breach the spending limit, they argued. We were told that it must have been dodgy data that swung the vote for Leave, or it must have been Russian involvement that swung that vote for Brexit. All of these nutty conspiracy theories have since been dismissed as the baseless smears that they always were. The Information Commissioner Office found no evidence of Russian interference in the Brexit vote. And now, much of this that was published gleefully by The Observer's so-called journalist Carole Cadwalladr, who our Remain backing cultural and political elites fell hook, line and sinker for. She was their anti-Brexit Boudicca, a champion of journalism that can help expose Brexit, they would believe, for the sham vote that it was, and see our horrendous vote by we plebs, the United Kingdom's biggest for anyone or anything, snatched from the hands of the primarily working class that voted for it, as they didn't know what was good for them, you see. And for our troubles, Carole's anti-Brexit journalist and fantasy were noticed by the likes of the Orwell Prize. She won it, for goodness sake, and she was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize as well. So blinded by their hatred of the plebs for vote for Brexit, they didn't think to check if there was any grounding to these baseless accusations that the vote for Brexit was either fixed or fiddled. There were allegations against Vote Leave. I won in court. The Electoral Commission, the regulator used as a pawn in the pro-EU machine against Brexit. It lost and was told it got it wrong in both fact and law. My name was cleared. And if I can just be serious with you for a moment about why it is that I feel so strongly about this, Carole would try to contact me. She'd scream down the phone saying, I need to talk to you, Darren. You need to talk to me. I'd say, I'm in a meeting. Go away. You need to talk to me. It was hysterical and it was frankly deranged, and I didn't need to speak to her because not only was she barking up the wrong tree, she was barking in the wrong forest. And I could see that others that had their names and reputations smeared could see that. And why couldn't then the Remain backing media and politicians that rub their hands with glee at being able to smear my name and ruin my early 20s with their baseless accusations think to do any research themselves? That's why, folks, I'm delighted, utterly delighted, thrilled, happier than a pig in poo, that according to Guido Fawkes, Aaron Banks has won in his litigation against the Observer's Carole. Guido says that Carole has, and I quote, finally admitted what we all knew. There was no evidence to back up her claims that the Russians financed the Brexit campaign or that Aaron Banks was involved in shady deals with the Russians. Why she left it to the night of the eve of the hearing to admit it was all bollocks, defies belief. Cynics might note she still has 2 crowdfunders running. Cadwalladr now has to pay £62,000 of costs on account this morning as a down payment. Expect that figure to go higher. Cadwalladr has avoided the humiliation of appearing in court this morning by submitting in writing an amended defence which removes the truth defence and the limitation defence. So with her gullible crowdfunders, Carole is arguing that this is about press freedom. It's absolutely nothing of the sort. It's about a woman who's made unchallenged accusations, lapped up by our cultural and media elites that were so desperate for the vote for Brexit to be overturned that they swallowed the snake oil that she was selling them. Willingly. I and Aaron Banks and others are owed a serious apology by Carole and those who used our articles to smear our name and accuse us of criminal wrongdoing. They owe an apology as well to the 17.4 million people that backed Brexit, only to be told that their vote was illegitimate, that they were duped by Russians or dodgy data, the same people that criticised Donald Trump for taking the election outcome to the Supreme Court, or trying to at least. They argue that the whole vote for Brexit was a fix. But folks, I wouldn't advise we hold our breaths for that apology. We had the last laugh though, ultimately, right? Carole has been humiliated. And I'll be raising a glass tonight. I want you all to do the same. And happy Thanksgiving to any Americans watching. But I'll be raising a glass to Aaron Banks. And I'll be saying, next time someone on the pro-EU liberal side of politics that shared and lapped up this Orwell Prize winning fantasist, remember that it's they who have been peddling democracy-denying conspiracy theories for years and years. The ultimate, my friends, hypocrisy. Let us know what you think in the comment section. Why were Remainers so desperate to smear my name and others, and desperate to swallow all of Carole's nutty fantasies? Are they just hypocrites, or was there something really quite sinister going on and seeking to delegitimize democracy? Let me know in the comment section. Now, next up, folks, I'm speaking to Matthew Lesh of the Adam Smith Institute about the Institute's new report that argues that the UK government should introduce a United Kingdom Free Speech Act, modelled on the First Amendment of the United States of America. Existing laws, as applied, the report argues, have created categories of speech crimes, and I would know all about that, wouldn't I, for offence, but otherwise benign political speech. Check it out and let us know what you think in the comment section. Do you reckon we need a Free Speech Act, or should we be wary about yet more legislation in this area? Joining me now is Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute, all the way from Australia. Hi, Matthew.
Great to be here.
Now, Matthew, can I ask you, why is the Adam Smith Institute advocating that the United Kingdom put in place a Free Speech Act modelled on the First Amendment of the United States of America?
Well, as you very well know, Darren, freedom to express ourselves is fundamental to who we are as humans, and it's also fundamental to free and democratic political debate. But as you've personally experienced, and many others have, for far too long, our laws have been used by people who want to censor speech. We've created an effective heckler's veto in the law, where you can claim to be offended, you can claim that certain speech is unacceptable, that it's distressing, that it's hateful, and then you can use the organs of the state, the power of the state, to censor speech. Now, this is very perverse. We have spent literally hundreds of years, dating back to the Magna Carta, trying to use the law to secure our liberty, to limit the power of the king. But now we've empowered the state to basically censor people. And you've got cases like yours with David Starkey. You've got Count Dracula and his shocking case where he posts a comedic video and gets fined for that. And we've even many, many more that we don't know about. We've got the London Met have reported that 400 people arrested in London alone over the last 5 years for communicating in an offensive nature, sending an offensive message or false information, as well as additional threats. So the reason why we think a Free Speech Act is important and necessary is because we want something akin to what they have in the United States, which is a First Amendment kind of situation where all speech is protected from government interference. And the reason why you need this is to ensure that two reasons. One, to ensure that free speech is fully protected, but also ensure that unintentionally laws do not are put in place that limit free speech, which is what's happened in the UK with things like the Communications Act or the malicious communications
Public
laws.
Order Act.
Exactly.
But yes, the report argues that the poor drafting of existing law means that as social attitudes shift, the categories of what is and isn't, the parameters of what is and isn't acceptable speech are becoming increasingly narrow. And, if I say, oh, Matthew Lesh has tweeted something I find offensive, distressing or hateful, I can report you to the police quite easily.
That's absolutely right. So even if it wasn't the original intention of the drafters of the law, the way the courts have chosen to interpret laws over time is in an increasingly expansive manner, to the point where it is fundamentally true that you can go to the police and report someone for what you perceive to have been a hateful comment. We've got to question whether or not we now need a Free Speech Act to counteract that. So we're actually calling for two things. One, we want to remove the kind of problematic sections of the existing laws, like the Public Order Act, like the Malicious Communications Act, that contain words like insulting and abusive, that have been really expansive in their legalistic interpretation, whilst leaving genuine, protection for speech that wouldn't be accepted anywhere. So speech which is actually threatening, speech which is harassment, speech which is malicious defamation. These are all protected categories of law. So these are all unprotected categories of speech everywhere in the world, and that would remain the case in the UK. But what we're saying is that we should have a far more expansive idea of what is acceptable speech, and we should have a clear law that says both to the courts that you can't infringe on speech, and also to the state. So, for example, if a quango would be interfering on somebody's speech in some way, let's say the Advertising Standards Authority was saying you can't make a certain claim in public, as has been the case this year on something like masks. So you can make that as a free speech argument and say that quango is interfering with our free speech to say that masks might actually be effective, which turned out to be the later public health advice. So we think it's really important to have an overall protection of free speech, which doesn't currently exist in the UK law.
What do you say to those, Matthew, who are critical of this for one reason and one reason only, and that is that they moan and groan at the idea that what we need are new laws, when actually, we saw this when the cenotaph was attacked. Actually, people were saying, the Home Secretary came out and said, well, what we really need is new laws. And everyone said, well, hang on a minute. What we actually need is our existing law to be applied non-selectively, essentially. And aren't we seeing that with free speech and with these different types of Public Order Act, whether that be the communicate, whatever law you want to select? It's the law itself that's been applied in either a disproportionate or a selective way.
Look, I think you're fundamentally right that we should be very hesitant to rush to make new laws if the existing laws can be used in the way that we need to use them. The problem is, as I think you're kind of getting to there in your remarks, is the existing laws have been interpreted in such a way by the courts as to make them quite restrictive of free speech. And the only way to fix that in our democratic system is for Parliament, where sovereignty ultimately lays as the representative of the British people, to come in and restore the most essential rights and liberties. And if you don't do that through legislation, it's practically impossible to do now that we've got all these legal precedents and we've got the previous laws that are problematic and need to be repealed if we're going to have free speech in this country.
Matthew, could you just quickly sum up what you view as a real threat to freedom of expression posed by the Law Commission's proposed legislation, or an enhancing of legislation, a furthering, a widening of hate crime legislation in this country, and the online harms proposals, as well as I think the Public Order Scotland bill, and what they would actually mean for freedom of expression up and down the British Isles.
Yeah, so part of the reason why we also think that this is the time for UK Free Speech Act is because of all these emerging threats to free speech. And we've identified three major ones on the horizon. So the first one is this online harms white paper that is being put in place by the government for benign reasons. Of course, no one wants online harm. No one wants bad things to happen online. But in the process of removing all harm, the government is wanting to put what they're calling a duty of care on technology companies, but really any company that shares user-generated content. So it could even be a blog by an individual. And they want to make it so that you have a mandate to deal with both legal content, but as well as legal but harmful material. So we're effectively, under these proposals, creating an entire new edifice created and regulated by OfCom, by a regulator, by a Quango, that will be able to limit speech that is currently legal. So it's not even just trying to say, well, tech companies, you really need to put in more effort to remove illegal speech. I think a lot of people would agree with that when it comes to, let's say, child exploitation or terrorism. It's really expanding where the state's involvement is in online speech. So that's threat number one. Threat number two is this issue we've got with the Law Reform Commission in terms of updating the hate speech laws. Now, as was identified by the Free Speech Union, what they're effectively calling for here would amount to a blasphemy law, something like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. Remember Just Sweet Charlie just a few years ago?
Yes. That
would actually become unlawful in the UK because it could then be considered inciting racial hatred. It would effectively say that if you, by religious criticism, offend somebody else, then you are the one who gets in trouble because of their actions. It's a very kind of victim blaming mentality built into there. So that's number two from Law Reform Commission. And then more specifically in Scotland, we have a proposed hate crime legislation bill that is extraordinarily expansive in terms of its scope. So it would, unlike usually these laws, if we were having a private conversation between two people, or even if I just wrote something down on a piece of paper, I was just thinking through an idea, that would be legal speech as long as they're not broadcasting it, even if it was otherwise unlawful. But there's no such exceptions in the hate crimes legislation out of Scotland. So it's effectively creating thought crimes. As soon as you think and write something that they consider to be unacceptable speech, you could be sent to jail or have fines imposed upon you. And then on top of that, it's kind of similar to that Law Reform Commission sense that the definition of hate is just so expansive. So you wouldn't really be able to have debates about things like trans rights issues that are obviously very controversial about what is gender and sexuality. You wouldn't be able to have debates about what is appropriate kind of religious practice. All these kind of very important debates going on in our society would actually potentially become unlawful in Scotland. And that's why there's a really broad coalition of people from the left to the right, from comedians to free market think tankers like me, who are saying that this is hugely problematic. And we're really hoping that the Scottish Parliament will narrow the scope of that legislation proposed by the SNP government up there.
Just finally, Matthew, whilst I've got you here, one big source of concern for me, but I know it will be shared by many people watching us tonight, which is that the way in which big tech, with these what are deemed to be monopolies, I know that the market itself isn't monopolized, they're not state-owned industries or anything like that. Many entrants can enter the market and compete with the likes of Facebook and Twitter, but let's be honest, in the grand scheme of things, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And we find ourselves in the extraordinary position where Donald Trump's tweets can come with disclaimers, which, you might agree or disagree with. I fundamentally think that it's up for the electorate of the United States of America to make those decisions and not have a tech giant tell them what they should and shouldn't think about a candidate in an election. But putting that to one side, what is the response, the pro-free speech and pro-business response to actually dealing with this problem, where you have what tends to be, let's be absolutely honest, disproportionately conservative thought, which is censored and attacked online?
Look, I think you're right in terms of diagnosing a problem here, which is that the tech companies have increasingly seen themselves, and this is very much a post-2016 phenomenon. So after we had Brexit, we had Trump, and you had the kind of left-wing backlash against that, there was this idea, this myth that it was all caused by Russian disinformation and people's social media consumption, rather than a willingness to deal with the underlying issues that were at stake and the reasons why people were disillusioned,
Carole.
and the reasons why people wanted an well, exactly. Thanks, Carole. The reason why people were voting for anti-establishment parties. And that kind of filtered through it. It kind of got internalized by the tech companies, as well as by legislators who are putting pressure onto tech companies to do things like fact-checking disinformation, or ultimately the case during the pandemic, removing disinformation. And a good example of this, I think, is the fact that if YouTube had a policy, and admittedly it came in later, if YouTube had a policy in January that said, we're going to use the World Health Organization to decide what isn't acceptable communication about the pandemic, then they would have been removing videos that disagreed with the Chinese position that there was no human-to-human transmission. They would have been removing videos that were pro-mask at the time, because the official position of most governments at that point was that mask didn't do anything. And the problem is when social media companies start to get in the realm of disinformation and facts. Sometimes there are very clear things that are true and very clear things that are false. But more often than not, the issues that are most important, the ones that we debate about, are far more complex than that, and have a lot more nuance, and mean that there are genuine disagreements and different viewpoints that should be put out there. In terms of what we do about it, I mean, the first thing I think we need to do about it is push back against the government pressure onto tech companies. We do have to realize that these tech companies aren't in a vacuum, particularly in Europe and the UK. They are under extraordinary pressure by politicians. If you tune into a parliamentary committee inquiry on anything online related, you're going to see this alternative universe where literally every problem in the universe is based on tech companies. Tech companies are responding to that in part, and the threat of regulation, like that online harms bill I talked about, or the EU is not very well known about, but the EU put forward a kind of a joint statement that they got all the tech companies to sign up to a few years ago about disinformation. Now, that technically doesn't carry EU regulatory law or any kind of formal enforcement, but the fact that they're using these kind of mechanisms, this kind of pressure, is the de facto threat of law, and that's a lot of the reason why the tech companies start intervening. Unlike some other conservatives, I'm a little bit hesitant about trying to step in to, let's say, you've got this idea about liability exemptions, Section 230. You can have a kind of discussion about that. It's kind of it's a whole ragtag issue of its own. But I'd be very hesitant about trying to legislate for kind of requiring tech companies to publish certain speech. To some extent, we do still have to accept that these are private companies, and they can choose what content they do and don't allow on their platforms. As they are censoring speech, people are looking for alternatives. I think you're being a little bit too pessimistic there, Darren. I think you're a fantastic example of this, of someone who's broadcasting an alternative perspective. And we've got a social media company like Parler that's got millions of users as an alternative to Facebook and Twitter. There's nothing necessarily cemented about any individual tech company, and they're all super competitive. And I do want to try to emphasize here that I think the best solution to this is innovation. And the reason why I said that as well is because I worry that if people who are on the conservative side of politics start thinking that they want to legislate what content can and cannot appear on tech companies, that's only going to empower and embolden the left to do this. It's notable that Joe Biden also wants to remove these kind of Section 230 protection from tech companies that mean that they're not responsible for the posts that you make. And that's because he thinks that's a pro-censorship line to get them to remove material. So I think some conservatives are potentially playing with fire in trying to seek legislative solutions rather than innovative and creative solutions that we can use to get out our message more effectively.
And that's a very interesting point, because the greater the myriad of rules and regulations that tech companies have to jump through, it's going to be the massive ones like Facebook that are able to actually take on the cost burden of those new rules and regulations, and the smaller market entrants will just be entirely priced out altogether.
That's absolutely right. And that's actually a key point when it comes to, I'll just explain quickly what Section 230 is, which is this idea that you should, a tech company like a bookstore. So for a bookstore, you don't require them to be legally liable for the books that they carry. So if a book is defamatory, you don't sue the bookstore, you sue the publisher or you sue the writer. And it's that same principle online, which is that if I post something defamatory about you, Darren, you can't necessarily straight away sue Facebook. You have to come to me, you have to sue me. And that means that Facebook and Google and Wikipedia, for example, can all host lots of people's edited content and people's self-made, self-generated content without coming under the liability as publishers that would just be outrageously expensive. So these tech companies couldn't exist if they hadn't had that kind of liability exemption, that kind of principle that exists under Section 230 of US law and Article 14 of the EU's e-commerce directive. That's kind of very much a building block of the internet. If you remove that building block, more or less, that these tech companies have huge budgets when it comes to being able to moderate their platforms. They're going to be able to deal with the potential legal costs. It's going to be the competitors to Facebook, to Twitter, to Google, who aren't going to be able to deal with it whatsoever and are going to really struggle. You're going to solidify, and this is a kind of a broader story about red tape and regulation. Every additional piece of regulation creates an additional barrier to entry and reduces competition in the market. So if you start playing around with the regulatory situation online, you're not necessarily going to be more pro-free speech. You're probably going to solidify tech company power, and they're in fact going to have to become more censorious because of potential concerns about liability. So I think conservatives are very much misguided when they think that going after tech companies through liability exemptions is the way forward. I think we need to go after them in the market by providing better products and by scrutinizing their actions, actually, because they do need to be accountable to their users, and we as the users do have power, because if we choose not to use them or we choose to complain, eventually it will get through to them.
Very interesting. Matthew Lesh, where can people find you on Twitter?
Just Matthew Lesh, at Matthew Lesh on Twitter. Or
you're one of those. You're one of those lucky people that managed to get their actual name.
I signed up for Twitter at age 16 or something in 2008. It was a fun, nicer place there, I swear.
Yeah, I bet it was. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I've got two fascinating bits of BBC News for you next. The latest Ofcom research, Ofcom being the regulatory body for broadcasters across television and the radio airwaves, has announced that BBC News has fallen to the lowest ranked TV news offering in the country, below Sky News, ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5. And just 58% of viewers now reckon that the corporation's telly news offering is actually impartial. Ofcom have warned that actually the viewer-broadcaster relationship could be jeopardised if the current state of affairs continues on this downward trajectory. Now, I don't know about all of yous, but I've got no idea how the hell Channel 4 News came second in the list. I would actually put them above the BBC, to be honest, but clearly those that watch the BBC Channel 4 News enjoy it a lot. I grew up watching it as a kid, and I tell you what, it's a bloody wonder I'm not a communist. It's the most biased, one-sided broadcaster on the telly, in my opinion. But look, that's irrelevant, really. My view on that's irrelevant, and it goes to the heart of my argument around all of these broadcasters. I don't care if they've got left-wing opinions or sympathies. What I do care about is them receiving public money or being state-owned to espouse these views, to champion these left-wing causes. I want broadcasters like the BBC and Channel 4 to be freed from such constraints, to be unshackled and label themselves as left-wing quite openly. I think it's about time they were transparent about the views and leanings, because right now they're doing so, and clearly the public agrees with me, but they do it covertly and pretend to be acting in an unbiased fashion, and we're just not buying it. We all know it's nonsense. So let's be open and transparent about it. Especially in the age of consumer choice, in the age where someone like me can set up a platform like Reason UK from my bedroom. And we should find ourselves in the bizarre situation that we're in at the moment, where we're having to fund the BBC's metropolitan left liberal opinions in order to use a television. It's 2020, for goodness sake. It's not the 1970s anymore. And there's also a massive collapse in the viewing figures of the BBC's Question Time programme. Its political panel programme. Despite the fact that licence fee payers shell out a whopping £1 million for the salary of the host, Fiona Bruce, it's yet another example of a pay packet that you simply wouldn't get without matching the performance to justify such an extraordinary salary. In the private sector, the public is quite quickly losing patience with anti-Beeb, and I say, long may it continue. Now, folks, finally, did you see that foreign aid will be cut from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% of GDP? Give us a like if you agree with this policy. But look, listen, folks, in my view, there shouldn't be any ring fencing of a budget like this. You know, David Cameron was at the height of liberal arrogance in assuming that he could bind the hands of his successor on his foreign aid liberal pet projects just to secure himself a legacy. You know, he was completely obsessed with nanny state projects here at home and abroad as a sort of patrician conservative. Now, the cut to 0.5%, that actually brings us far from making us an international pariah, which the likes of Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby have said. It actually brings we're in line with other G7 nations, and it saves 5 billion quid. And to be honest with you, which of course 5 billion quid we could bloody well do with that right now, but Boris Johnson, in annoying David Cameron over this, in annoying Tony Blair over this, in annoying John Major over this, in annoying the Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby over this, he must be a politician that's in tune with the British people for once, because boy oh boy, we all certainly know that they aren't, are they? Let us know in the comment section. No, listen, as an example, right? I remember when I worked at the Institute of Economic Affairs, there was research on nanny state pet projects that had gone through DFID, gone through our foreign aid budget, and it found that 6.8 million quid had been spent on a research unit to study how salt affects Chinese home cooks and how much they add to their food. 1.5 million quid was spent on a research project in India using text messages to persuade people to drink less alcohol, and 348,000 quid was spent evaluating a sugar tax in Chile, and then almost 800,000 was used to train Bangladeshi imams to preach tobacco control. So it's quite clear to me that in recent years, as well as sending money to China to help pay for rice production, China, of course, being with the coronavirus, the only country in the world actually predicted to grow this year, it's quite clear to me that it's very wasteful. And whilst, of course, we should help people around the world in severe crisis, I think the ring fencing of this budget has just led to gross abuse of taxpayer money. And we need to ensure that comes to an end. And, you know, it might have made sense when David Cameron was doing his best, as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, to get the Liberal Democrats in bed with him and to hug Huskies. You know, it might have been a clear electoral strategy for him to try and pander to Liberals on foreign aid. But if you look at the polls on this, it's not at all clear that it's a sensible electoral strategy for Boris Johnson. YouGov is quite clear. 66% reckon it's right to cut foreign aid, and even most Labour voters, 44% of them, reckon we should do it too. A majority of Remain voters actually agree with this too. So it doesn't make sense for Boris Johnson to keep that target in place. And I just say, folks, to argue that this country won't have any clout in the world with this cut is so beyond ignorant, it's farcical. We have to ensure that we focus our resources on those struggling at home, and it strikes me as somewhat incredible that our media and political elite are incensed about a cut to foreign aid. You know, where was their anger as the government candidly destroyed viable businesses, once viable businesses, that won't likely return in a hurry here at home through its lockdown strategy? Where was their anger as we propelled millions at home into financial and mental misery through the government's lockdown strategy? They endorsed all of this. They said that the government should lock down sooner and harder. They are the ones that have caused this economic shock, that have ensured that the next generation will be paying off vast amounts of debt for years and years to come, and potentially not get the gainful employment that they need to get the experience to get on that employment ladder. And they are the ones that advocated this lockdown strategy. They destroyed the British economy for the foreseeable future. So forgive me if I don't assume that there's going to be cash sloshing about that we can willingly spend overseas. Yous are the ones that ensured that we would have to make cuts to expenditure or significantly rise taxes. There isn't the wiggle room to spend it on nanny state pet projects abroad or wasteful foreign aid expenditure. And I think it's also ignorant on another level. I'm losing my voice. It's because I've been blabbing too much. I will go in a minute, I promise. It's ignorant on another level because, you know, besides the United States of America, this is a country that spends more on keeping the world safe, spending billions on defending democracy and peace abroad. And we ought to be expanding global Britain's trade policies. You know, it's through trade, not aid, that you help the world's poorest. And that's a reciprocal relationship as well. If we want your products, you sell us to them and boost economies around the world. And as I say, you know, we are doing so much through NATO to keep the world safe. The idea that we are some international pariah for cutting 0.2% off of the foreign aid budget, that's ridiculous, liberal, miserable, anti-British fantasy. It should be rejected wholesale. These people aren't serious. They are cartoon. And I say to all these MPs arguing that they'll vote against the cut, to look at the public polling. If they are seen to stand in the way of protecting taxpayer money from waste and not choosing to spend it at home at a time of economic crisis that many of them have voted for through the lockdown strategy, and at a time when we are spending billions more on defence, which will help the world, then I think they're doomed to repeat the same ignorant, out-of-touch mistakes as they did in their opposition to Brexit. So let us know in the comment section, what do you reckon? Are the Conservative Party right to do this? Have they got your support in their moves to cut expenditure from foreign aid? Do you think the Liberals are completely out of touch and far removed from the views of the people, you fantastic people out there? Anyway, listen, that's all we've got time for. I'm off for a special Thanksgiving dinner, but not with turkey. I don't know about yous, but I just don't like turkey. But I'll be raising a glass to Aaron Banks, as I say, and to all of you and the United States of America. You know, despite their ill-advised rejection of the British monarchy, of course, they're a fantastic nation and will continue to be so. And I love them dearly. They've done much good in the world. I think that's the bottom line for me, folks. We just need to reject those that seek to... It's like listening to a mate. If you know a mate wishes you well, you listen to their advice. If you know someone doesn't wish you well, you'll be less likely to listen to their advice. And I think that's what we've got to do about those that say the United States isn't a great country, or that our own country is going to become an international pariah if we don't spend an extra 0.2% of GDP on foreign aid. It's ridiculous. It's all cartoon. We've got to reject these people. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let us know, did you enjoy the show? Did you enjoy the format? Leave a comment in the comment section. Make sure you're subscribing on YouTube. And if you're in a position to support our crowdfunding efforts, it really does help ensure that we can keep the show on the road, as it were. So please do give a donation, no matter how big, no matter how small. And I'll put this out as a podcast as well. So whatever podcast platform you use, if you just search Reasoned Conversations, you should be able to find it on whatever provider you're actually using, and subscribe to the podcast so you can actually get Reasoned Conversations when you're out and about on the move as well. Right, I'll see you next time, folks. Thank you so much for your support as well. It's very, very humbling and means a lot. All right, speak soon. Ta-ra!